Just going to start by welcoming everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm from Engender. My name is Alice, and this is the fourth in a series of events that we've been holding this afternoon with organisations across the UK. So we've heard from Northern Ireland, from women involved in the peace process there, looking at poverty, looking at COVID-19. We've talked all about sport with Fawcett in England, looking at representation, access and misogyny in sport. And we've just heard from Wales looking at representative politics, looking at quotas, looking at an expanded Senedd and how that might improve women's representation in politics. And I think a thread that held all of those events together was the acknowledgement of a long line of activism and feminism and of standing on women's shoulders. So a perfect lead into this event tonight, where we're going to be talking about To Exist is to Resist Black Feminism in Scotland. I'm going to introduce our chair, Assa, and then I will get out of your way. So Assa Samaké-Roman is a French journalist covering Scottish politics, current affairs and culture for both French-speaking media and Scottish media, writing opinion pieces in the national newspaper and website. Her first book, Écosse, Adrienne à la licorne, was published in November 2020, and she also co-produces Écosse Toujours and is currently working on the launch of La Revue Écossaise, a magazine about Scotland in French. Thanks so much for joining us and chairing, Assa. Over to you.
Thank you, Alice. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being with us for tonight's chat. It is my immense pleasure to be here to discuss a fantastic book, To Exist is to Resist Black Feminism in Europe, co-edited by Professor Akwugo Emejulu and Dr. Francesca Sorandi. So Akwugo is with us tonight. She is Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick. Her research interests include the political sociology of race, class, and gender, and women of color's grassroots activism in Europe and the United States. She is also the author of several books, including Fugitive Feminism and Minority Women and Austerity, Survival and Resistance in France and in Britain. Akwugo, welcome. How are you?
Hi, also, I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Alice, for the invitation to speak. This is going to be really great. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Me too, me too. How do you feel today on International Women's Day? I had people all day long wishing me have a very happy International Women's Day. Is this something that you say? Do you feel particularly happy today?
Oh, maybe I'm just a terrible person, but I luckily do not have anyone in my life who wished me a happy International Women's Day. And I have to admit, I don't know if that's actually something I would say to someone, like wishing them like happy, you know, Eid or like Christmas or whatever or something. I don't know if that's something I would do. And I also don't know if I feel particularly happy because there isn't actually there isn't a lot to be happy about at the moment, whether that is the cost of living crisis, whether it's the war in Ukraine, there's, whether it's kind of endemic police violence, there's a lot that that is challenging us at the moment. So I have to admit, I'm feeling a little down, I will say, but also I would never wish anyone a happy International Women's Day. And I will say just very briefly for those people on Twitter, I'd like to know who actually configured this bot. So whenever some kind of hypocritical corporation posts a tweet on International Women's Day, the bot will automatically tell you what the pay gap is at that organization. And so I think that's really good to kind of hold people to account. So I think it's important to kind of, we have both of these ideas in our mind that, like, yes, hooray, celebrating women, I mean, I guess, but it's more importantly to say, well, the people who are making all of this noise, what are they not doing? And why they're making this noise in order to kind of obscure kind of some really disappointing practices within their workplaces.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. So back to our subject for this evening, which is your book. And could we start by just talking about how the book came about? Can you tell me more about the whole process?
Oh, sure. So the book was actually born out of a series of events that I've co-organized since 2016 called Black Feminism, Womanism, and the Politics of Women of Color in Europe. And those events were held, and I co-organized the first event with Francesca and a number of other colleagues when I was still at Edinburgh. And then we kind of carried on in order to edit the book. But let me just say a little bit about those series of conferences. So those conferences were really kind of born out of deep frustration, because as an academic in Europe who does work on gender and politics, I was, for years, I would go to a bunch of specialist conferences full of feminist political scientists in Europe. And for the most part, no one was willing to talk about the experiences, the particular experiences of women of color, and the particular experiences of Black women in Europe. And I kind of, so not only would I be one of the only Black women in the room, but that's just how it is. But it was also this, this wall of resistance to actually acknowledge that, first of all, Black women exist, women of color exist. There are, we have a particular kinds of politics that sometimes overlap with white women, but more often than not are in conflict with white women. And there was a resistance to talking about that. And so out of like losing my mind at one of these sessions, I said, I'm going to organize something that's for us, but also to show them that we're here and we're doing politics in this really interesting way. And so these events were these opportunities for women of color activists from across Europe to come together to talk about kind of key issues, to strategize, to network, but also to have fun and to eat together, to dance together, to do all of these things and just be a space for learning, for radical education, but also for respite and for rest. And so that was something that was really important for me and all of the co-organizers I've worked with over the years for that project. So that being said, given that this event, there were kind of 3 iterations of this event, and it might come back pandemic pending, but like, let's see what happens. The book was born out of these events of meeting and hearing from a number of Black women across Europe who are doing really interesting work about, on a range of different topics, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And it was really important to Francesca and me to capture these experiences, and also as a way to kind of hopefully supplement the archive, the archive of Black feminist activism in Europe, to say, there are people doing great work, and let's capture this moment so that the people who come after us can, won't have to go through what we went through, having to kind of relearn and excavate a particular moment in time in terms of the history of Black feminism in Europe.
Mm-hmm. You've touched on so many subjects that we're going to talk about tonight, but the first thing I want to ask you about is about the title of the book. I think it's really, really powerful, and it may be a bit silly, but it made me think of a French song by a French singer from the 1980s called France Gall, and the song is Résiste, prouve que tu existes. Resist, prove that you exist. And this is a song that is a call to be active and fight for yourself, be an agent for change, never give up. And there's a sense of urgency, I feel, in the song, but also in the title. Is that the feeling that you had writing and co-editing this book? Is it a wish that you have for all Black women in Europe to resist and prove that they exist? And is this something that you see Black women on the continent do everywhere and every day?
Yeah, sure. So the title of the book is to exist is to resist, is kind of one of those chants, slogans, memes, I'm not sure what you would call it, that is something that's present within Black feminist and Afro-feminist politics. And so it's kind of taken inspiration directly from the activists themselves. And the activists themselves say, by not living on my knees, by not kind of laying down and giving up, by kind of persisting in a context that Audre Lorde talks about, to survive in America is like living in the mouth of a dragon. That's one of her kind of famous quotes. And so the idea is, you getting up and being out in public space, you kind of just going about your daily life in spite of the things that want to harm you, in spite of the things that want to kill you, is something important. And it's also, and I should say, none of this is theoretical. We can look at what's going on at the Ukrainian and Polish border, where kind of Black folks who are literally fleeing for their lives are being turned away or being turned into kind of second-class citizens. So it's one of those things of, to exist in these kind of overwhelming spaces of whiteness means something. We can read a kind of politics from that, and we have to take that seriously into our, in our kind of everyday lives and in our politics.
Mm-hmm. And it seems it's such a paradox, and it's a recurring theme in the book, the fact that Black women in Europe are both invisible. So as you said, that we're not really taking seriously the experiences of Black women in Europe. But at the same time, they're also hyper visible. So as you said, people are being turned away from, while they're fleeing war in Ukraine. There have been so many also controversies and debates about Black women and women of color in Europe over the past few years. So it's really difficult to navigate this world where, Black women are kind of stuck between these two extremes, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that's Gail Lewis, the academic, talks about this wonderfully, about this idea of absent presence, and so this idea, this strange contradictory phenomenon, as you say, about this idea of being invisible. And so you're kind of not seen, not taken seriously, your politics are not taken seriously, kind of you're not really heard, or you're kind of patronized, but then you're also hyper visible. You're hyper visible in terms of being criminalized, in terms of being kind of noticed. You're kind of a Black body in white spaces. And so, you're kind of, and so you're kind of given this kind of negative attention. And so it's kind of the worst of all worlds in these ways. And I think that is a really complicated and difficult way to navigate. But I guess I will say that whilst this is difficult, what this idea of not being able to be seen clearly does is that it creates a different kind of space in which Black women occupy that we can kind of come together, build solidarity, and develop, particular kinds of activism and politics that speak to our interests and needs. And so I guess for me, that's something really important to emphasize, that it isn't all doom and gloom. So I was just at an event via Zoom, so I was like, have not left this chair for several hours, but on honoring Bell Hooks. And so Bell Hooks has one of her most famous texts is called Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. And Bell Hooks, so much of her work is talking about the power of what it means to be on the margins. So to be outside the white gaze, to be able to, marginality can be used as a space for rest and recuperation, can be used as a space for strategizing and organizing and developing solidarity. So this idea of invisibility, hypervisibility is really nuanced and complicated. And so I want us to hold on to that idea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What I loved about this book is that it's not just, as you said, about doom and gloom and painful experiences. It's also about inspiring each other, taking care of ourselves also, and, existing and being able to find a place and find a voice. And it's not that often, is it, that Black women and women of color are portrayed like that?
Well, I guess it depends on where you read, right? Where it's one of those things where I kind of opt out of a lot of things where, like, if Black women and other women of color are not seen as kind of active agents, then this is not a space that I will be in, and these aren't kind of the waters I will swim in, as it were. So I don't know, and I guess we're kind of very lucky at this moment that not only is there kind of feminism, more broadly speaking, is kind of very trendy and fashionable at the moment. So we're having very different kinds of conversations that we would have been having 5 years ago, and certainly 10, 15 years ago. Like for me, it's a transformation working with students, where like 15 years ago, no one would admit to being a feminist. Everyone thought, you know, feminists were kind of man haters, bra burners, all the rest of it. It's a totally changed landscape. So for me, it's been very interesting to kind of teach through this kind of shift in consciousness. And so for me, it's the idea that there are all of these opportunities to have really interesting and important conversations, and they are happening, but I think more often than not, for those conversations that are inclusive, that really kind of push people, and then have other ways of thinking about, you know, the possibilities of existence, aren't necessarily happening in the spaces you might think they are. Like, for example, you know, I was saying before about some of the frustrations I've had about working with people who profess to be kind of interested in feminist politics. Like, even a conversation like this at Engender is something that unfortunately, sad to say, is actually very unusual, but I'm happy to be here and I'm happy that we're having this conversation. So like, thank you, Alice, for this space, because certainly this is something that's not typical, particularly in a Scottish context, but and unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, in the kind of Scottish feminist scene more broadly.
Yeah, we'll come back to that a bit later. We're going to talk about that and address all these questions more thoroughly. Is there, or are there, common denominators between the experiences that Black women have all across Europe? Because we live in very different countries. I certainly feel that my experience being Black here in Scotland is very different from my experience being Black in France. And I think my experience as a Black woman here is very different from the experience of a, you know, English-speaking Black woman who's been brought up here. So, you know, can we really find some common points between all these experiences?
Well, before I answer that, can you just tell us more? Like, what have you noticed as the difference between being in France and being in Scotland?
So what I generally say is that in France, I am first and foremost Black, whereas in Scotland, I'm first and foremost French.
Yes.
So yeah, this is the thing. It's practically, you know, as if I was given you know, a break on my Blackness here.
Yes.
People don't notice that. It's really strange. People don't notice that first. They notice an accent, then, you know, they notice my nationality. And also I know that my nationality, because, you know, it's Western European nationality, it's quite valorized. People, you know, they like France. So it would be very different if I was, you know, a Black person coming from an African country, I feel. But yeah, it's a totally different experience.
Yes, I completely agree with that. So for people who don't know, because I'm sure they're like, why does Engender have this American who's at this English university as part of their kind of Scottishness, whatever? So I actually live in Glasgow, and I've lived in Glasgow for 20 years. Recently, I was down in England for a couple of years, and I moved back out of horror. And so I needed to kind of come back. So just in case people are wondering, like, why are you speaking to this random character? So I agree. I've actually never felt more American than being in Scotland. And that's the thing, is because first people are like, okay, we obviously see that you are like not from here and you are clearly from elsewhere. And then people want to hear the accent. And then once they can place you, I've said this a lot, that you can actually see people visibly relax. Like, and so I know that if I was, even though I have a Nigerian name, I know that if I spoke with a Nigerian accent, that I would be treated very differently in Scotland. I'm very confident about that. But having this American accent means that people treat me very differently, and it's very different than how I was treated down in England. But in terms of the issue of the common experiences across Europe, I mean, there are a lot. I think what's important for people to understand is that the Black feminist and Afrofeminist movements are connected. So you know, they cross borders, they cross ethnicities, languages, and religions. And I think that's something that's really important to emphasize, that folks are in a constant conversation with each other about strategy, about tactics, about experiences, about relief, about joy, about all of these different things. And I think it's really important to emphasize that. And so whilst there are these kinds of differences that we've talked about, you know, And I think Scotland is very unusual, to be honest, in comparison to a lot of other European countries. And I've, said this before, but I think it's important for folks to realize that, in Scotland, the dynamics are different, because when we talk about who the other is, for many European countries, the other is the Black or brown migrant, or the Muslim, or the illegal immigrant. Whereas in the Scottish context, the important other is the English. And that actually takes a lot of heat off of a lot of different kinds of people. Not to say that this is some sort of wonderland, but what it means is the starting position of a lot of these conversations are very different. And as a result, you haven't seen the kind of, we call them political entrepreneurs, these kind of far right political entrepreneurs. They haven't been able to kind of gain a base in Scotland because the significant other is are the English, which is something that's very interesting. So going back then to this idea of the kind of these common experiences, a lot of the really interesting work in Black studies at the moment talks about this idea of anti-Blackness. And so unfortunately, anti-Blackness is global. So no matter where you are, you experience very similar experiences. And so, we talked before about the idea of hypervisibility and invisibility. Those things are kind of a common experience for lots of Black women. One of the, and just to highlight specifically for those who might not experience this, the classic thing is walking down a European street and having people walk into you, or people expecting you to move out of the way for them. That is such a common experience that people expect you to move out of the way when you're on a sidewalk, or pavement as it's called here. And this is the ways in which Blackness, ways in which we embody Blackness, or Blackness is read on us, we see it in these kinds of dynamics. And so whilst we might all be speaking different languages, and might all have kind of different experiences of the social welfare state, might have different class positions, what we know is that Blackness is unfortunately to be feared. And what that means is Black women have a different relationship to femininity. And those are the kinds of experiences that bind us together. And so we can speak a common language when it comes to something like Black feminism.
Mm-hmm. And also what's important, so obviously we have like all these, common experiences, but I find that there's such a wealth of terms to qualify, Black women's identities, Black women's activism, and Afrofeminism is one of these terms. And curiously enough, this is not something I've really encountered that much in the UK. So every Black woman who's an activist I know in France probably would call themselves Afrofeminists, but not really here. And I'm not sure people really understand the differences and the nuances between Afrofeminism and Black feminism. Would you mind maybe walking us through what both of these terms mean?
Oh, sure. So to start with Afrofeminism, because I think that's actually that's really important, because that might not be a term that is familiar to kind of Anglophone speakers, because first of all, but it's not exclusive, but it is a dominantly Francophone approach to feminism. So I think that's something that's important to bear in mind. And what we see in thinking about Afrofeminism is a sustained conversation between folks in Francophone Europe and on the African continent and in the Caribbean, which is a slightly different kind of orientation and conversation than you would see in Britain and in other European countries, I will say. So this sustained conversation about the struggles of police violence in France have resonances and similarities and patterns to what you see on the continent and what you see in the Caribbean. So to resolve what's happening in the old imperial metropole requires a conversation and intervention in the old colonies, right? And so it's this conversation. It's a much more specifically anti-imperialist conversation, I believe, which is slightly different than Anglophone kind of Black feminism, where the terms of citizenship are not are more settled, but certainly not perfect. So, and I think the other thing to supplement this is because particularly in the British context, where there's an ability to talk about race, even though, you know, things are still terrible, that means that the way that you can organize then, there are different kinds of possibilities than what you have in France, where, for those who don't know, officially in France, race and racism do not exist. So whenever I tell my students this, my students kind of don't believe me. They're like, but how can, that doesn't make any sense. How can that be? And I was like, but it's, you know, people have been prosecuted for talking about state racism, as we would call it here, institutionalized racism. People have been prosecuted for that. And so what that means, the possibilities for organizing, that doesn't necessarily stop Afrofeminist activists from going out and doing interesting things, but the ways in which you orientate yourself are different because you have a different kind of framework to think about your activism. So does that make sense? Is that helpful to people? Because in order to get into, we have to get into this long history of the particularities of the French Empire, which is different from the British Empire, which has a direct effect on the ways in which people do their activism and the way that they think of themselves and their belonging. I think that's something, you know, their belonging to their various nation state. I think it's actually something very interesting and important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really clear. And sometimes it feels as if, you know, Black feminism, Afrofeminism in Europe was a new thing. If you listen to some politicians, if you listen to some journalists, basically what they're saying is that we are importing some debates that are happening in the United States, here in Europe, and here in Europe, you know, we are far ahead of that. We are in a post-racial society, or we live, you know, in the area of universalism, which is something that is quite popular at the moment. It's as if, you know, racism, misogyny, misogynoir also, which is a term that I've been reading quite a lot these past few years, as if this was not, you know, a societal issue. Basically, racism, sexism, it's all an individual choice. It's just like these people who are mean to Black people, whereas it's not really that. So what I found interesting in the book was like all those chapters talking about creating an archive, writing our own history. Why is this so important in your opinion?
Well, it's understanding the history of Black feminism is about, in Europe, is also understanding the history, is about understanding European history, that Black feminism, and it, you know, has always been part of European history. People don't seem to believe that. People kind of think that kind of like, you know, Black feminism or like Black folks kind of popped up either in the post-war period or in kind of the 70s and 80s, you know, these different kind of waves of migration that, you know, somehow we just arrived and then we're here. But to understand and to properly contextualize kind of Black feminism requires an understanding of various European imperialism practices, but then also the anti-imperialist movements of which Black women were leading at that time. And so these resistance efforts, you know, we're talking about since the 18th century, but this is not a history that Europe wants to talk about, because it's actually quite embarrassing that when you think about the Enlightenment period and, you know, this time of kind of liberal humanism and this idea of human flourishing, you know, when you actually read, because, you know, I think you should read Kant, I think you should read David Hume, you should read these people, and they will tell you directly that they're not talking about Black people and Black women in particular, that we are not fully human, that the ideas of the Enlightenment are for a select few. And that's really important to understand, that kind of particular kinds of withdrawal and exclusion and erasure of which Black women and other kind of radical and revolutionary forces have been fighting against literally for centuries. But I think it flatters an idea of kind of quote unquote European values to think that the problem of race and racism and white supremacy is an American problem. And whenever anyone talks about race in a European context, they're just importing American race politics. And, you know, I'm here to tell you that Europe murders Black people in jails and prisons. We, as I, will keep saying and we'll keep reminding people that literally the borders remain closed to African students fleeing Ukraine to this day. Borders are still closed to them. And so this tells us, this also tells us about what European values are. And I think we have to be honest about not valorizing these ideas. And because once you walk away from valorizing, these ideas of, these European values of democracy and, freedom of expression and all the rest of it, then you can see more clearly those people who are drowning in the Mediterranean, those people who are drowning in the English Channel. And you also see then more clearly the kinds of activism that has always been there in order to resist these kinds of border regimes, and also to resist these kinds of kind of hideous exclusionary politics, all done in the name of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Is it surprising that sometimes it's people who identify as left-wing, progressive, liberal, even feminists who push back the most against that, and just, don't really see the point of Black women having a voice, bringing their activism and ideas to the table and challenging them also?
Well, I will say that this is why the archive is so important, and protecting and preserving the archive, but also adding to and expanding the archive is so important, because once you understand that this is one of the main sources of conflict within radical spaces, like, it doesn't make it any better, especially when you're experiencing it, but at least you know that it's like, you're not crazy, and that like all of your feminist, Black feminist foremothers also went through the same problem of trying to get ostensible, radical and revolutionary white allies, particularly white feminists, to work together. This is an ongoing issue and problem. And I've been studying kind of women of color's activism for 15 years, and the problem of solidarity between different racial and ethnic groups is the stalking horse of my research. I've yet to do a project where people don't throw their hands up in frustration and exhaustion to say, I cannot get these revolutionary and radical white folks to take race seriously. And what we know is, and because this is what our foremothers had to deal with as well, is that, there's a sense that kind of race, and to a certain degree, gender and sexuality are superfluous to the movement, right? So these are the old communists, the old school socialists who say, when you talk about race, and to a certain degree, when you talk about gender and sexuality, you're splitting the movement, you're splitting the workers, right? Because it's all that matters, or, your relationship to the means of production. And, that's not wrong, but also it does matter in terms of, your relationships to the means of production are also determined by your race, your gender, your sexuality, and your disability. Like, give me a break. And when we're talking about feminists, there are a lot of feminists who are absolutely resistant to thinking of themselves, white feminists, to thinking of themselves as racialized, because they kind of think of themselves as beyond or without race, and their politics beyond and without race, right? And the only people that race really attaches to or has meaning for are Black and brown folks. And like, our job is to say, no, even if you don't talk about race, race is still here. Like, I was kind of asked to give a talk for kind of the First Minister's kind of National Advisory Council for Women and Girls. And I kind of said this, and people were very resistant. They kind of nodded, but you could see that they were very resistant to taking that on board. And that's the struggle, where, kind of lots of well-meaning people, say they want to kind of work in solidarity, but the reality is they don't want to confront some kind of uncomfortable truths about the nature of their politics.
Yeah, it's a very awkward conversation to have sometimes in activist circles, in feminist organizations. It's not always easy. So I completely relate to what you've just said. Now I want to talk about, you as an academic with an interest in race, gender, and class. So I don't know, if you realize this, but if you were, you know, teaching at a French university at the moment, you'd probably be cancelled by the government. So you have two people in government who are none other than those in charge of education and higher education, who have been very publicly attacking professors of humanities and social sciences and accusing them of Islamo-leftism, whatever that means. So they would call you an activist academic, which in their view is very, very wrong, because they say you can't study something while being part of it or having a very active interest in it. Do you feel there is a contradiction between being an academic and activism? Do you think academic work and activism should be kept strictly separate?
Well, I'll first say that, to be honest, I have colleagues who have said that to me in the past. So while it absolutely is, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say like a witch hunt, what's happening in French academia, but then also you see this in other spaces as well, this idea of these kind of anti-feminist and anti-gender and illiberal forces targeting particularly kind of feminist academics and anti-racist academics. Do you see that, you know, spreading across Europe? And I do wonder, we'll see how long this government, as in the government at Westminster, lasts, because we can see traces of that kind of forming at the moment. But is there a difference? Well, I mean, I guess it's, you know, if we go back to the old idea that the personal is political, the old feminist idea that the personal is political, then look, I'm not really prepared to have this long conversation about this. I am in my academic position, and I have these particular interests because because first of all, it's super interesting. It's like, but more importantly, no one, for the most part, is interested in studying these movements. So I'm not saying there's some great people, Vanessa Thompson in Germany, there are like folks all over who are doing great stuff. But one would think, I'm just saying, that feminist political scientists and feminist sociologists across Europe would be interested in these kinds of mobilizations, particularly in light of the massive protests, the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw, not just across America, but across Europe, talking about the very particular deaths in custody in various European countries. The fact that we do not see a lot of people studying this tells us that even in this moment, where I'm sure many of our participants went to one of these demonstrations or protests, so even when people are like participating in this, it's still not seen as like real knowledge or knowledge worthy of kind of close, careful academic study. And I just kind of reject that. And I guess you're never going to get from me some long justification of what I'm doing. And because it's like, look, I'm doing it. If you don't like it, please go away from me. Do you know what I mean? It's like, sorry. And I don't know. And the idea that one should be alienated from the thing that you study is like super old school, and I don't really have a lot of time for that. You know, what gets me up in the morning is hoping that I'm making a difference, like with my students, but then also in the kind of research that I'm doing, that I'm hoping to kind of leave a legacy so that the people who come after me, that it's easier for them to exist in academia and do kind of work beyond that, kind of challenges the taken for granted assumptions within academia.
Mm-hmm. Before we open the session to questions from people attending, I wanted to end on a more, let's say, artistic, inspiring note. So doing my research for this event, I found that you made a playlist a few years ago of songs that remind you of the protests for Black lives. And I was wondering if you had songs that spring to mind when you think about Black women's activism, more particularly, and activism in Europe.
Oh my God, man, I wish I'd gotten this question in advance, because I mean, look, you've actually done something really terrible, because I'm now gonna maybe bombard you with like various playlists I have. So like you've dug your own grave here, I'm sorry, because it's like now you're gonna be spammed with like music from maybe, this is like, I'm a super nerd when it comes to this kind of stuff. I think a couple of things just that pop in my mind. Mississippi Goddamn by Nina Simone, Young, Gifted, and Black by Aretha Franklin. Oh gosh, some stuff by Solange, I think, but you know, her voice is really, but people love her for whatever reason, and it's fine. it's fine. And I'm just trying to think, I'm trying, who have I been listening to recently? And it doesn't have a little kind of feminist bent to it. No, I think a lot of what I've been listening to recently probably is not appropriate. And I think people will be shocked that I'd be listening to it. So I don't know if I can out myself for some of the stuff that I'm listening to that is not really politically correct. So I'm really sorry. So
it's fine. It's
is
fine.
it fine? Okay, because
it is.
Okay, because there's a lot of trap music and a bunch of other stuff, which, you know, if you're really listening carefully to the lyrics, you're like, this is really problematic. But anyway, that's another story.
How important is creative expression and art in, you know, shaping our imagination and understanding ourselves and the world? And this is something that you have witnessed in Europe, you know, Black women doing activism through the medium of art and creativity.
For sure. Look, let's take it back to the old communist phrase, we want bread and roses, right? And I think that's what's so important about this, that it's not just about survival. We want beauty and art and music and all of these kinds of things. And so the best, I mean, I don't know if I've studied a Black feminist activist network where folks don't have some kind of artistic, they themselves are artists or have some sort of artistic expression that they do. You know, I'm just so inspired, you know, so kind of Moissy Collective that are in Paris that I'm sure you know very well, you know, and before demos, you know, they have these sign making, you know, parties where, you know, they get people together and they kind of make the sign. Their signs are always very evocative, always great. And it's this moment of joy and kind of solidarity and kind of this community building before the protests, which, you know, could go one way or the other, depending on, you know, what the police are like that day, right? And so you kind of always have these moments of pause and critical reflection that happen through the process of making something creative, which I just think is so important, I think, too often overlooked when we're thinking about activism.
Yeah, exactly. And that was going to be my next question. Often we oppose different kinds of activism as if you had, like, you know, proper activism, being in the streets under the rain and in the wind, handing like leaflets to people, knocking on doors, demonstrating, going on strikes. And obviously this is activism as we know it. But, you know, sometimes it's as if anything else is either superfluous or futile. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, that's actually really interesting because that has been a source of that's been a real, not problem for me, that's been something I've always wanted to push back on within academic circles, because when we think about kind of social movements and activism, we oftentimes are thinking about those kind of spectacular displays on the streets, right? But of course, that first of all, that ignores all of the kind of hidden, unsexy, boring, but actually essential work that happens behind the scenes that makes it possible for people to be out on the streets, right? And the people who are doing all of those undercover, we call it care work within these movements, most likely women, you know, who are making the tea, you know, doing printing for those flyers, you know, keeping the WhatsApp group going and the, you know, maintaining your Instagram page, all of that boring drudgery is activism, but it's hidden and it's devalued. So that's really important. But also, I've always, you know, maintained that the kind of we have to have a broader idea of what activism is that includes issues to do with mutual aid, self-help, self-advocacy, because that oftentimes is not considered real activism. But in fact, that's where you find the vast majority of Black women and women of color who don't think of themselves as activists, but are doing the essential work of survive, you know, of helping their community survive. And that oftentimes is never thought of as activism, but in fact, that is crucial. You know, I just think that's crucial. Whether that's kind of lots of kind of English language classes, food bank stuff, all of these kinds of things are activism. And I, just so folks know, so as a result, I have a very broad idea of activism. It's like people joining together who are doing interesting things in public space. That's my definition, because that's the only way that you can capture the spectrum of activity that Black women are involved in. And especially when for the most part, they will not necessarily name themselves or identify themselves as activists. That's really important to understand.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what do you think the future holds for the Black feminist movement in Europe, and where does post-Brexit Britain fit into this?
Oh gosh, well, your guess is as good as mine. Who knows, right? I'm one to try to be optimistic. I mean, things aren't looking great for Europe at the moment, right? I mean, and folks will be resisting and doing their thing. And so I want to be optimistic, but things aren't looking great for anybody. And so who can say? I think regardless of the catastrophe or the disaster, there will be people there to do what the state won't do and do what fellow citizens won't do, which is protect the despised and disrespected others. And to be honest, Black feminists have always been doing that, and I assume, and they will carry on doing so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I see one question from someone attending who is asking you, I would be interested to hear about political Black feminism in 2022. What does it mean for people like me who are South Asian and have grown up with political Black feminism?
The the perennial question in the British context of political Blackness. Well, I mean, it's funny. I guess I don't know who this person is, but it's very interesting because there's been a decisive shift away from talking about political Blackness. And I think that's probably right, because I think the idea of people kind of claiming Blackness but not being people of African descent is deeply problematic. And I think it's possible to say we don't need a concept such as political Blackness, because really what people are trying to get at are the particular kinds of social conditions, particularly from in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Britain, where the shared experience and the shared identity of being a post-colonial subject is what I think people are getting at when they want to evoke an idea of political Blackness. So you're trying to get at a sense of solidarity between different kinds of people of color. Look, get with it. I'm all about that. Like, I organize these events on Black feminism and the politics of women of color of Europe in order to bring together different kinds of women of color in Europe. And I got a lot of flack for it from some Black feminists who said this should be for Black women only. But because I said I've been in Scotland for 20 years, and Scotland, there aren't a lot of Black folks here. And what you see in activist spaces is the very thing that you're talking about, the sense of solidarity between different kinds of people of color, different kinds of women of color coming together to organize. And I wanted to kind of honor the tradition that I have been living in for a while. So whilst I don't think it's helpful or useful, because also what it does is just mean you're arguing with people about political Blackness, when really what you want to do is have a conversation about solidarity, because there are lots of shared experiences of being a person of color in a European context. I would just say, why do we need this term anymore? But what we can say, what we can hold on to is that sense of solidarity. And I think that's what's important.
Mm-hmm. We have a second question that I'm going to read out loud. Loving listening to this discussion of creativity and resistance. We know that Black creators are kept from jobs, roles, showcases, etc., particularly Black women. How can we better equip unions to support Black women, often freelancers, with specifically equality and diversity-based exclusion?
Well, the first thing is not to rely on the unions to do those things. The unions have been notoriously terrible, on these issues. And so I would say that part of the job is, how do you bring together these freelancers into an organization, group, or network in order to more effectively, collectively bargain for their interests? And then hopefully you can approach the union as a group in order for them, and to pressurize them to kind of to take up your interests and concerns. So for me, it's one of those things where the unions, particularly in the British context, have a terrible track record on all of these issues, right? And so these guys are not, mostly guys, these guys are not going to be in your corner automatically, despite what they say. And so they have to be pressurized just like the rest of these cultural institutions who thrive on the precarious labor of creatives. And so just to give you an example, it's not the same, but my good friends and colleagues, Lucy McEachen and Katrina Duffy, who are the co-directors of Panel, which is a feminist curation studio. They've been working with makers in order for makers who are kind of, disrespected and precarious creative workers who don't have a lot of status. They've been working with makers to help bring them together, to put pressure both on the Scottish government as well as Creative Scotland for them to get recognition, but then also for them to get specific funding streams, because, you have all the other kind of creative arts have their own streams and kind of recognition, but you don't have that for makers. And so I think that's a really interesting model to think about in terms of thinking about kind of Black and women of color, precarious creative workers. I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. Another question just popping on my window. Thanks for a brilliant discussion. I found what you're saying about Black women in activism really important. As a white feminist organizer of things like union speaking and rep, protests, events, etc., I'm always seeking to include Black women's voices, but is there a risk of imposing a particular version of activism by doing this?
So I don't think there is, because it's one of those things where if you're open to, because often, I suppose what I'll say is, what more often than not, what we see is that people will think that Black women and other women of color who are active in public space, who are doing various things, who are not doing activism, are somehow not really activists. And so I think the job is to be as open as possible and to kind of reach out and try to connect with people who you think are doing really interesting work, and also who's not a maniac. Like, I don't know, I just feel like there's a standard of are they nice and are they doing interesting stuff? And who cares whether they call themselves an activist? The question is, are they bringing people together to make some kind of positive change? And I think kind of keeping an open mind about that is at least half the battle, right? And I guess, and then I think that also avoids the problem of tokenism, right? That you're kind of looking for, some Black woman's voice. And what does that even mean, voice? Really what you want is someone's labor, their intellectual labor, their hard graft. And so the question is, how can you reach out to them in a way that's open, welcoming, inclusive, but then also ensuring that the thing that you want to achieve is actually in their interest too. And the question is, do you have the ability to talk it out with that person to say, if that's not quite in their interest, can you change a wee bit so you can bring them on board and so you can work together? So really, it's just about flexibility on all sides here in order to kind of build the solidarity necessary in order to go out and make change.
Thank you very much for this answer. Are there any other questions? Feel free to, add your questions in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over to Alice. Now's your chance. I can't see other questions. So Alice, I guess this is us for tonight. Thank you so much, Akwugo. That was amazing. I could continue for, the whole evening, but I need to let you go back to your life at some point. And I have a child to feed as well, so
right,
I need to go as well.
Well, no, thank you. No, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was your questions were wonderful, and honestly, it was so great speaking to you. And you're in Edinburgh, right?
I am in Edinburgh, yeah.
Okay, so I'll have to kind of come through to see you. So
definitely. Let's grab coffee soon.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I think Alice wanted to get back in here. So
yeah.
I would just to say that. Thank you. That's us really. And yeah, not happy International Women's Day. Please remember International Women's Day as a protest, not a celebration. But thank you so much for this, and thank you to Fawcett, NIWEP and One Wales, who have been involved in the previous discussions. This has been recorded, so will be appearing on Engenders on the Engender podcast at a time in the future. Obviously, please buy the book if you haven't already got it. It's brilliant, and it's in quite short little sections, so it's very good if, like me, your attention span is a bit short after pandemic. So great book. Thank you so much, Akwugo and Assa, and have wonderful evenings, everyone.
Take care. Bye, you guys.
Bye.